So once you have those pieces cut down to the inner line, you're going to be ready to put them together. We'll start by putting the back piece right side up, you can see here, and then the two front pieces right sides facing the back piece. And then we're going to go ahead and sew them together here, and you're going to do that using bias tape. So if you're not familiar with that, go ahead and make sure you watch the last video where I explain it. And if you have any hacks, so like this is the collar button front hack, it's not going to change this first step. It's really only changing once you finish kind of like the general construction. So we can go ahead and start by sewing them together here. So after you've got your shoulders sewn together, we're going to open it up like this and keep the right side facing the top. So as you can see, this is the back, this is the front, this is going to be where the arm is. And then we're going to sew our sleeves on. So you'll just line it up with right sides together here, and then sew it on with bias tape like you did the shoulders. And since you will have this this seam here that you just had sewn, I recommend facing them both towards the back. So you'll kind of you can iron them or you can push them towards the back, and then just make sure you're pinning that in place. I like to do that on both sides just so it's uniform, and then if you want to wear your coat reversible, then it looks a little cleaner that way. So we can go ahead and sew those on both sides. So now that we have our sleeves sewn on, we can go ahead and flip our jacket so that the right sides are together. We have our sleeves lined up like this and the side. Unless you're perfect at cutting fabric, you may have some unevenness right here in the armpit. I know I have before. It can get hard to cut things exactly, especially when you're doing thick fabric, like quilted stuff. So you'll want to smooth out the armpit if you have any of that. Don't create any like super harsh lines. I would keep the curve the same, but still just smoothing it out to make it easier when you're actually attaching the bias tape. So we'll go ahead and attach that now. I'll show you how I go around the curve here in just a second. So I start to pull it tight and kind of curve it right around here. And you will have this part come up. That's okay, because it's gonna help with turning it over to the other side. That's just what happens when you're binding curves. And it may take some readjusting after you kind of get the initial binding in place, just to make sure there aren't any creases or anything. So you can see here, I'm not going to keep that like that, but I do want to at least pin this in place and then kind of rework over here. If you're feeling nervous about this seam, just do as many pins as possible. I think that really helps with keeping things in place. The other thing you can do is change your needle. It gets so thick right around here, so having a fresh needle on your sewing machine definitely helps. And then just really taking it slow and steady when you're actually doing the sewing. I have had to hand crank around the armpit before just because it's so thick. I didn't want my needle to break. But really just keeping it slow and it depends on how thick your fabric is, but doing things slowly and whatever you need to maneuver your fabric the way it needs, it'll all help a lot. So you can see there are some like waves here. That's okay. It kind of happens naturally since it is such an intense curve. You just want to make sure that when you're actually sewing it, you're not creating a crease. So you can see kind of right where I'm going to sew, it's not really wavy anymore. So just make sure when you're sewing over those parts that they're laying flat, and then you should be good when you turn your bias tape over to the back. So we can sew that in place now. So after you finish sewing the side seams and up under the arms, all that's left to do for a regular standard Gibson coat is finish binding right here along the sleeves and then all around this raw edge here on the neckline and the bottom. I do recommend starting your bias tape on the right side. I find that it looks cleaner if you're sewing it down here and folding it over and then sewing it in place from this side, but honestly that is a personal preference. If you're doing a hack like this one, we're going to be adding the collar, or there's the shawl collar one, or really any other hack. You may have to do something else before you put on the finishing binding, so make sure you look at those instructions or watch that video if that's the case, and if not, then you can go ahead and bind this and you'll be done with your coat.